So his biographer is a lifelong friend, and you got to read the biography that way. But Gilmore, having committed to missions, said, I've got to prepare for missions. While I'm preparing for missions, I'm going to do missions. And he did street preaching. He did evangelism house to house. He was engaged in the ministries of his church. And he started studying Chinese because the Congregationalists had 2 mission stations in northern China, and he thought that can be a good jumping off point for what I want to do. So I need to learn Chinese. Now, you don't learn Chinese in England, but he was studying it. He was working on it. But he told his teachers, he told the mission board, he says, I do not want to be in northern China. You've got plenty of missionaries in northern China. I want to go somewhere where the gospel is not being preached by anybody. And frankly, they said to him, Gilmore, if you go somewhere that's virgin field, you're basically going to spend your life explaining John 3:16 to people. Don't you want to use all that Greek knowledge you have? Don't you want to be teaching we could station you at a college over where you're teaching mission. And he says, no, I want to share the gospel with people. That's my calling. And they said, okay, we'll send you to Mongolia. February 10th, 1870 in Edinburgh, he received ordination to serve there, and he sailed from Liverpool at the age of 27, February 22nd. So he's not a kid. He's been preparing now for years. And he arrives in China. So a little bit about Mongolia. Massive area, 3,000 by 900 miles between Russia and China. Very sparsely inhabited, one of the most sparsely inhabited countries in the world. In 1800, it was 1 person per 15 square miles. That is, you could walk a long time without seeing anybody. Mostly highland desert. The Gobi Desert covers about 2/3 of the country, the western 2/3 of the country. And it's a tough place to live if you're not a local. Maybe if you are a local. In fact, a lot of the locals would leave Mongolia and go to Beijing for the winters, right? Because long, brutally cold winters that start in September and run till March or April, and just incredibly cold, massive amounts of snow. But because it's high tableland desert, it turns from being brutal winter to being scorching summer in just a few weeks. And pretty soon the temperatures are in the 90s and they're baking you in extremely low humidity. Dust storms would blow up, which there's no defense against. And they have a thunderstorm time during their summers in which basically all these dry gullies run with water and everything gets soaked and everything gets covered with mold. And then it dries out again and it's cold again. That's living in Mongolia. Furthermore, the people were Buddhist. Thoroughgoing Buddhists. Nearly half the adult males were Buddhist priests. They called them lamas. And they made their living basically going around doing Buddhist rites with people and begging alms, sort of like monks or friars. It would be difficult, Lovett says, to find another instance in which any religion has grasped a country so universally and completely as Buddhism has Mongolia. And you think of India with Hinduism, you think of Japan with Shinto, but this was well-nigh universal. There was virtually no rival in the country of Mongolia. Buddhism was the religion of the people. And Buddhists, if you studied missions at all, you know that whenever missionaries arrive in Buddhist countries, the Buddhists tend to look down on them. They think their religion is the most advanced, the most cultured religion there is. These people were addicted to whiskey. The stories he tells about whiskey in this culture they would be funny if they weren't so sad. I mean, these people would have whiskey with breakfast every morning, just a cultural addiction. They would tend to do economic business with the Russians to the north and the Chinese to the south, and they came out the losers on these transactions over and over and over again, so that the whole population was just buried in debt. And they were extremely argumentative. Gilmore said, it's the strangest thing to meet a Bedouin Mongolian in a tent out on the high desert and have him start asking you about how God can be an individual God in eternity and all these philosophical speculations. And he said, these people are really hard to convince of the simplest truths while they're drinking their whiskey and deep in debt and leading miserable lives. So this is a tough place to go as a missionary. There were LMS stations, London Missionary Society stations, in Peking, which I'll call Beijing for the rest of our time, and in Tientsin, which is modern Tianjin in northern China. And so that's going to be his base for going into Mongolia. And there had initially been LMS attempts to evangelize Mongolia. Some heroic missionaries had gone into Mongolia in 1817 and had been there for about 24 years, which is really significant. Now, they were mostly in eastern Mongolia, which I'll say more about later. It's more of an agricultural area. But they had worked on the Mongolian language. They had translated the whole Bible into Buryat Mongolian, the main dialect. Shortly after leaving the field, they finished it. They had been ordered out of the country by the Russian Tsar, who was in charge, who had the authority to do that at the time. And during those 24 years, they had been unsuccessful in establishing any churches, and they didn't know of any Mongolian converts. That is, they had poured their life into this field, mastering a very difficult language with virtually nothing to show for it. So Gilmore arrives, 1870, and right after he arrives, the Tientsin massacre occurs. Periodically, during the 19th century, the Chinese populace is going to become frustrated by Western involvement in their culture. And it often breaks forth into mob violence against Westerners. Eventually, it's going to culminate in the Boxer Rebellion, and there are even going to be more examples after that. The Tientsin massacre were northern Chinese rising up in the city of Tianjin and basically slaughtering virtually everyone who was Western. The missionaries, a number of them escaped, but it really put a scare because it was believed that this violence was going to occur in Beijing as well. So the missionaries said, we got to get out of here. The safety is south. So they were packing up to get out of town and move south until things simmered down. Gilmore had been in the country for 1 month. And he said, south is the wrong direction. Mongolia is north. I do not want to go away from the field where I've been called to serve. So against the advice of everyone in the mission compound who barely knew this guy, he says, I'm going to Mongolia. And so he found a Russian merchant who was heading north, and he paid to join the caravan, and they jumped on the main road. There was a main road that ran from Beijing to Kyakhta on the Russian border that cut right through the heart of Mongolia, and he rode with the merchant all the way across the country. He knew very little Chinese, certainly not enough to converse with anybody. He knew no Mongolian. And he finds himself on a several-month-long caravan journey through the heart of this country, unable to really do anything, extremely frustrated by his inability to engage Mongols, some of whom knew a little Chinese, some of whom knew a little Russian, but he couldn't talk to them. He arrives in this border city on the edge, a Russian city on the edge of Mongolia, and he finds a Scottish merchant there, a man named Grant. And Grant was so happy to see another Scotsman, he says, I'll put you up. And he lodges with him for a couple of months. And the man was a believer. And so he begins looking for a language teacher. Can't find one. The Mongols in that part of the country didn't have language teachers. Nobody did that for a living. And so he can't find anybody to teach him Mongolian. So he's lonely. He's going to church with Grant. And he feels like he's still not accomplishing anything. So I know what I'll do. I'll go out onto the great plain where the Mongols are. So he does. It was within traveling distance from Kyakhta, but he goes out onto the plain, and he finds a Mongol there who's friendly and says, hey, you can live in my tent. And so he invites him into his tent, and he begins living with this Mongol. He lives with him for 3 months, from December to February. Those are tough months out on the high plains. But he's learning to be a Mongol. And interesting thing happened with his language studies. In order to have breakfast, you've got to figure out Mongolian for may I have breakfast. And you need breakfast. And in order to do anything, you got to figure out how to say it. And living among the Mongols, he begins picking up the language in daily conversation. Now, later on, he's going to have to figure out all the grammar. But he's speaking pretty tolerable Mongolian within 3 months. Remember, he had kind of a gift for languages. And he learned to live as a Mongol. I'll say more about this later. But Mongol lifestyle and the lifestyle of a typical Scotsman are about as different as they could conceivably be. And he's settling into the culture. He would every Sunday go into Kyakhta and worship with Grant at a little Scottish church there, or a little Western church. It wasn't Scottish, a little Western church. But the rest of his time, he just lived among the Mongols. And the Mongols fell in love with this guy. In fact, for the rest of his life, they're going to call him our Gilmore, because they do not know any other Westerner who has been willing to become a Mongol to win the Mongols, to live in their tents with them, to love them. He's young. He begins to travel. He travels all over the country with various caravans, seeing different parts, figuring out how the caravans work. He goes up into Russia, crosses Lake Baikal, and visits Siberia, and he keeps working on his Mongolian. By September of 1871, he is conversing in Mongolian and has mastered to the point that he's beginning to write sermons and letters in the language. The Mongols had never seen anything like it. And it's a hard language. It is a language which is written vertically. I don't even know how that would work. But that's a picture of Mongolian script. And in the winter of 71, he went back to Beijing, and he reported into the missionaries who had returned from their flight south. And the first thing the missionaries realized was that, hey, Gilmore's alive. He went up. We didn't expect to ever see this guy again. We thought he was going to, turn into a frozen sculpture up there in the middle of Mongolia. The guy's back. Furthermore, the guy can speak Mongolian. And he resumes his study of Chinese there. And he doesn't rest for the winter. He pours himself into working with the Beijing missionaries. He starts working with a doctor in the clinic there in Beijing and starts picking up medical knowledge. Why? Because he discovered that the Mongols don't have decent medicine. And so no matter what their problem is, they suffer with it. And so if he can just pick up a smattering. Now, the philosophy back in Scotland was, don't give missionaries a little medical knowledge, it just makes them dangerous. And Gilmore is going to say, that is a bad philosophy. Because sure, if I try to do surgery on somebody who needs a new gallbladder, I could be dangerous. But there are 1,000 little things somebody with a little medical knowledge can do for these people. And so he started picking things up. And he's learning spiritual lessons. I'm just going to share one of those lessons which really struck me, because this is a guy out wandering across the high plains just trying to impact Mongols. Sometimes for weeks and months, he wrote, I look forward to some crisis which is coming. It comes off well. And in 2 days, I am if I had forgotten that to which I had looked forward with so much apprehension. In this manner, I am not only guilty of ingratitude, but lose much joy and strength of faith and hope. What should make me more happy than the thought of the helps and deliverances that God has vouchsafed me? And in troubles present and to come, what can give me more faith and courage than to remember that out of such troubles I was delivered before? I won't camp here because we don't have time, but my wife and I have seen off 3 sons who have moved out of our household, gotten married, settled in other parts of the country. God's blessing them. And now we're seeing off our daughter, the 4th and final one. And somehow seeing off those 3 sons has not fully prepared us for seeing off the daughter. And when I read this from Gilmore, I thought, isn't that the truth? God can come through for me over and over and over again, and yet I can still have anxiety about the very thing he took care of me last time. Well, Gilmore was a regular person like you and me. He didn't have a Superman's S under his shirt. He's just a regular guy wandering across Mongolia trying to talk to Mongols. And that brings us to 1873 and 74, what he called his first Mongolian campaign. Now, he's learned the lay of the land and spent time living with them. He sets out from Beijing to evangelize Mongolia now, having the Mongolian language and culture in place. He becomes a Mongol. He dresses like them. He eats like them. He gets their lifestyle through and through. And he shares the gospel. He shares it in every way he can. He discovered that when he tried to preach, it was tough. Because Buddhist preachers don't give a homily for 30 minutes while people listen. Buddhists just gather a group of people and discuss theology with them. And he discovered that when he tried to preach to a group of Mongols, every point he would make, they would ask a question and respond. And pretty soon it was just a conversation. So he thought, okay, my preaching from now on will be conversations. And so he did. He did conversational preaching. Gather a bunch of Mongols in a tent and discuss Bible texts with them and answer their questions and share the gospel. He used medicine to try to meet their needs. He said almost every Mongol, man, woman, and child, has something that wants putting right. So that is, if I use medicine, I can have an inroads here. And he became quite an accomplished medical, I wouldn't say doctor, but he got pretty close. He traveled across Mongolia, meeting Mongols and sharing the gospel, Mongol after Mongol after Mongol. And then he returned to Beijing. And he was living with Dr. Meach, who served in the clinic there. And he got to thinking that, I wish I had a wife. I'm in my 30s now, and there was a picture hanging on the wall of a young lady named Emily Meach. Oh, her last name wasn't, her name was Prankard. She was Mrs. Meach's sister. Emily Prankard was there on the wall, and the Meaches proceeded to tell him what a godly and good woman she was. And he was sold, right? And he got permission from the Meaches in January of 1874 to propose via mail. The first letter I wrote to her was to propose, and the first letter she wrote to me was to accept. Romantic enough. He said, well, that's weird. Well, when you're in Mongolia, you do what you got to do. This was Emily Prankard, and she did, in fact, correspond with Gilmore for some months to find out what she had gotten herself into. She also wrote to his family up in Scotland. They invited her to come to Scotland and spend some time with them. They wrote to Gilmore and said, how did you find this girl from the other side of the world? She's awesome. So she sailed to China, arrived on December 3rd, 1874. Gilmore wrote, we never saw each other till a week before we were married. That's a bit of an exaggeration. It was 5 days. And my friends here drew long faces and howled at me for being rash and inconsiderate. What if you don't like each other? How then? It is for life. As if I did not know this all along or long ago. So she arrived on Thursday, and on Tuesday, James and Emily were married. Am I recommending this procedure to you? Not necessarily. I did see, though, a meme a couple weeks ago that I thought was really, really good. The meme said, how do you know whether you're married to the right person? Answer, read the name on your marriage certificate. Yeah. Two godly people can have a successful marriage. If they're married, they're required to. But this is not necessarily the ideal method of meeting someone. But she won over the Beijing missionaries almost immediately. She was a very godly woman. They were very happy together. And for the next 10 years, they're going to serve together. So serving with Emily. Praise the Lord, for the first year they were together, one of the families in Beijing went on furlough. And so they settled into Beijing and served there for that first year, which was good because he's picking up medical knowledge. She's learning the culture. They're thoroughly involved in mission activities and evangelism. But by the next year, it's time to go back to the Mongolian plain. And Emily says, I'm going with you. And she does. Lived in a tent like a Mongol. That was tough. They arrived, you'll notice, in April. When they arrived in April, there was ice everywhere. Within a few weeks, the ice was melting. And by May, it's getting hot. By June and July, it's extreme heat. In the middle of this brutal summer, they had a 36-hour windstorm that blew over everything, coated everything with sand and dust. And then they had the rainy season. And Emily had never seen a rainy season like this. Pretty soon, everything was wet. That is, you get up in the morning and you're wet, and you grab things, and everything's wet all the time and gets moldy almost instantly. And then by about the time everything's drying out, ice is forming again. And they returned to Beijing in September. Furthermore, the Mongols had a tradition, or it was their culture, of just going in and out of each other's tents. That is, you don't stand at the door and knock. You don't call out. You just walk in. That is, privacy was not exactly a Mongol category. And they discovered that if they said, please don't come in our tent until you introduce yourself, the Mongols were very put off by that. And so they didn't. So they thought, well, maybe we can get some privacy by wandering out away from the little place where the tents are all set up. So they tried that. They walked out on a hill a half mile away so they could talk. When they got back, they found out that the Mongols were like, why are they wandering out there? I wonder what they're up to. What is going on with these people? So they gave up their walks. Because Gilmore is not going to do anything that is going to obstruct his ministry to Mongols. But it was a tough life. Biographer says if James Gilmore manifested a Christ-like love for the ignorant and stolid Mongols, so also did the delicately nurtured and refined lady who, in order to do her part in winning them to the Savior, endured privations, faced perils, and bore a daily and hourly series of trials so irksome and so repugnant that no motive short of all-absorbing love to Jesus Christ is strong enough to account for her endurance. That was the song we heard during the offertory this morning. How love for Christ is what will give you the ability to endure this. So he went as a servant. I'm here to serve the Mongols. And they had never seen a Westerner willing to become like them. I already mentioned him giving up his morning walks. They ate like the Mongols. The Mongol diet was millet and mutton. Millet is a coarse grain, which is very healthy, good for you, and tastes nasty, I'm told. Right? But it's you can live on it. But that's what they ate, millet and mutton, because there were lots of sheep. And it just about destroyed Emily's digestive system. That is, when she dies young, they're going to say, it really started that first Mongol campaign that she was out on the high plains. It kind of wrecked her health. So the question is it worth it? Are they seeing success? Gilmore estimated at the end of this second campaign that he had personally conversed with virtually every Mongol trader on the entire Mongolian plain. No one had converted to Christ. Not one. And so, in 1877, the LMS had a meeting to say, maybe we should discontinue the Mongol mission. Does it make sense to send a young couple to destroy their health in this incredibly forbidding environment if nobody's going to get saved? Does it make sense? Gilmore said, I'm pretty sure the Mongols still need the gospel. Pretty sure they do. I'm pretty sure God is still omnipotent and can save them when he pleases. And in classic Gilmore style, he said, perhaps many people would have more disqualifications than myself. I've learned Mongolian. I'm going to continue serving there. Emily bore him a son, 1878, James. They called him Jimmy. A year or two later, she bore a second son, Willie. And when they went into Mongolia the next time, she took her baby with them. If you can picture the ice and windstorms and with an infant. But she's going to serve alongside her husband. And the infant apparently survived. Infants are tough. They would winter in Beijing every year, but there were Mongols there because a lot of the Mongols didn't like living in the winter. And so these caravans in the western part of many of the traders would come down and set up tents in downtown Beijing and just live there during the brutal months before going back. Now, not all of them did, obviously, but many did. And so Gilmore would go and work with the Mongols there. He would evangelize among the fairs. He would evangelize in the markets. He sold religious literature. Now, that might seem surprising to you, but they produced Mongol booklets, and he would charge for them. Not much. But what he discovered was that if a Mongol paid you for something, the Mongol valued it and would read it. If you gave them something freely, they'd glance at it and throw it on the ground. And so he actually did a rather brisk business. What was kind of beautiful about this was that the Mongols would often say, would you please read the book to me? And so as he's selling the book, he would open it and begin reading the book. And oftentimes they would let him read much of the book to them, and they would just stand there waiting. Now, the Mongols thought they were kind of ripping him off because we're getting the hard copy and we're getting to hear it read, for one price. But for Gilmore, this is sharing the gospel through the printed page. And he's going to do that for basically his entire ministry. He's going to preach through conversation. He's going to do medical work. He's going to hand out tracts, and he's going to sell books, trying to get into these people's lives. In 1882, he and Emily went on furlough. Emily's health had badly begun to fail by 1880. She was struggling with her breathing. She was weakening significantly. And Gilmore had been in China for 12 years. So they went back to England and Scotland, spent 18 months there. A little longer than the average furlough, but they were trying to get their health back. They visited friends, many of whom could barely recognize them. That is, these are still young people, and yet the work is really affecting them. But while he's there, as he's going around to the churches telling his stories, life among the Mongols, somebody says, you ought to write this down. This is amazing. And so he wrote Among the Mongols, and it became a bestseller. It's firsthand account of what life is like in this very, very unusual place. Gilmore wrote in one of his diaries, I think I could make a lot of money if I became a writer, but God's called me to be a missionary to the Mongols, and he never wrote another book. One of the reviewers of that book really put his finger on Gilmore. As for danger, Gilmore had made up his mind not to carry arms. That is, there were a lot of dangers out there on the plains. He would not carry a weapon. Not to be angry with a heathen. What a great resolution that is. Never be angry with somebody that I'm trying to win to Christ. And happen what might, and though he does not mention this, not to be afraid of anything whatever, neither dogs, nor thieves, nor hunger, nor the climate. And he kept those 3 resolutions. 3 resolutions. Don't defend yourself, don't get angry, and don't be afraid. All right, well, that takes grace. Well, they returned, and in 1884, leaving Emily in Beijing with the boys, he set out on a short Mongolian trip. He wanted to get back out on the plain. This time, he said, I'm going to maximize my contacts by traveling with Mongols, and Mongols typically travel either by foot or by ox cart. And so he dressed up with all his possessions and put a knapsack. Here's a picture of Gilmore with everything he's taking with him for the trip. And he sets out on foot in these massive journeys into Mongolia, walks of 20 and 30 and 40 miles. Everywhere he went, the Mongols flocked to him. He'd been away for a couple of years, and they loved him. I mean, high-level Mongols, leaders in their religion, all the way down to servants carrying your bags. They all wanted to be around Gilmore. He had become one of them. And during this trip, he met Boyinto Yauge. And Boyinto Yauge said, I have believed in Jesus. When you were here last time, you explained the way of life, and I have been thinking about it and reading the sacred literature you left with me, and I have believed in Jesus. And Gilmore said, I left something, which he in fact had done. Part of my pack, I left at my last stop. Would you go back with me to retrieve it? And Mr. Yauge said, yes, I will walk with you. It was 23 miles. And they walked the entire way so that Gilmore could make sure this man really understood the gospel. And he tested him and challenged him and asked him questions. It virtually destroyed Gilmore's feet. I mean, he had walked there, and now walking back was really hard on him. But he said later it was the pleasantest walk I ever had in Mongolia. Boyinto was a true believer. After returning to Beijing, Boyinto was connected with a relatively recent American mission in the city of Kalgan. Kalgan was another Russian town on the border of the High Plain. And a missionary there, an American by the name of Sprague, got in contact with Boyinto Yauge and baptized him there, and wrote to Gilmore saying, man, I wish you could have been here to baptize this man. He gave God the glory for sending you to lead him to Christ as he went under the baptismal waters. Well, they were back in Beijing, replacing missionaries on furlough, and by this time, Gilmore is becoming a frustrated man. One person saved for nearly 14 years of painstaking, arduous toil. I've got to see more results. And he became kind of fanatical. He'd get up at 6 a.m. every morning. He would be at the market by 6 a.m. every morning. He would work at the market until 10 p.m., live in a tent there for much of the time, sharing the gospel with Mongols and Chinamen over and over and over again. He saw a number of Chinese come to Christ because his Chinese had become very good by this time. God blessed them with a third son, little Alec, in August of 1884. But he barely noticed because he was keeping up a frenetic pace of ministry. In fact, he had always been a well-read person. He said, I don't have time to read books anymore. I'm evangelizing. And he stopped reading books. He had attended Western services on Sunday. Don't have time for Western services anymore. And he'd spend all day Sunday at the market evangelizing. He had very little time for his wife and kids and was not seeing them very much because he was so frustrated that so few were being saved. He's evangelized Mongol after Mongol after Mongol. They all love him, they all hug him, and they all walk away saying, thank you for taking the time to share what you believe, but we're Buddhists. And then in the spring of 1885, his dear wife Emily grew very seriously ill. For a while, he really couldn't see how ill she was. And he was leaving her and going off and working in the market all day long and not spending time with her. And finally, she said, James, would you stay with me? I don't know how long I have. And he did. And he spent some time with her. And on September 19th, she passed away. They had been happily married for 11 years. She was still a very young woman. He grieved like you and I would, and perhaps even more, because he had, in his fanatical zeal to be out preaching the gospel, he had forgotten his first ministry, his wife, and now she was in heaven. He had 2 little boys, but as missionaries in China discovered, the boys cannot survive from about ages 5 to 12 on a foreign field. They will get malaria, they will die. And so the missionaries invariably sent them somewhere in a better climate during those years. That's a whole discussion. Frankly, there's no solution to that. That is, you keep them with you, there's high probability they're going to die. You send them away, it breaks your heart. You say, well, they shouldn't have children. Most of these missionaries didn't even believe in birth control. Or, well, send singles then. Bad idea to send singles to these fields. Typically, so many temptations. I don't know of any solution. So he sent his boys back to England. They actually lived in Scotland with their uncle in February. He wrote them constantly. They wrote him constantly. We have a number of their little childish letters to Gilmore that he carried around in his pocket during his evangelism. He loved them greatly. And then his heart was broken again when Alec, his baby, got sick and died at the age of 3 in 1887. All of this is getting his attention. And he's realizing that, my efforts are not going to win souls. I can burn myself out and work 6 to 10 and ignore normal life, but that's not going to cause somebody to trust Christ. And after the passing of his wife, after the loss of his little boy, he said, you know what? I need to settle in and do ministry with a proper mindset. And he felt like the Lord was calling him to a new field. And that'll be the end of our discussion, just the last 5 years. There was a whole section of Mongolia that had no evangelism whatsoever, and it was Eastern Mongolia. There were more Mongols living there than out on the plains. But about half the people living there were Chinamen. That is, it was mixed population. They lived on crops, planted crops. They lived in towns. It was a very different life than out on the plains. There were no missions there, but there was an American mission to the plains out of Calgon. So we thought, let's let Sprague work with the caravans. I've witnessed to everybody up there. And let's go to this new field. There's no mission there. There are more Mongols there, and it's dangerous. Crime is rampant there. It's a hard place to be, and nobody else wants to go there. I know Mongolian. I'm going to go there. It wasn't even easy to get there. The main road ran right through the Gobi Desert. Eastern Mongolia was very difficult to reach. And he discovered that the inhabitants were dominated by 3 primary vices. Just like the Western Mongolians, they all drank whiskey. In fact, whiskey was the big cash crop. They also grew a great deal of tobacco. I won't camp here, but it actually raised a bit of a controversy in the mission, that this is the 19th century. You and I are kind of used to smoking being recognized as a bad thing. In the 19th century, a lot of godly people smoked and didn't think much of it. And when Gilmore saw how tobacco was destroying the lives of so many of these people, he said, I'm not going to allow anyone to be a member of a church in this area unless he gives up tobacco. And the Beijing missionary said, you can't do that. You can't require somebody to give up tobacco to become a member of your church. And he says, listen, maybe most places that doesn't make sense. It makes sense here because these people are addicted to whiskey, tobacco, and opium, and they got to give up all three. And he began evangelizing these folk. How's he going to do it? Well, he's not going to live out in a tent now. He lives in an inn. He missed the tents because these inns were filthy. They were crime-ridden. Typically, it would be one room with a whole bunch of mats with people sleeping on them, and you're clutching your possessions to make sure somebody doesn't steal from you during the night. They were just horrible, rat-infested, and so he'd move into these inns. And then he would go down into the city squares and evangelize, just as he always has. 3 key cities in eastern Mongolia. He established a base in each. He would set up his own tent near the markets whenever they would have these trading fairs, and he would conversationally preach, hand out tracts, and sell books, and set up a station with free medicine. You need help with a sore tooth? I'll help you with your sore tooth. You need help with a sprained ankle? I'll help you. I've got some know-how. Mostly he spoke Chinese. Everybody understood Chinese there. But sometimes when a Mongol came up, he would shift to speaking Mongolian. And they say, wow, you know our language. And he was able to connect with these people. And even the Eastern Mongolians loved him. And he became Chinese to win this area. Do you know the story of Hudson Taylor and how he dressed up as a Chinaman? Do you remember what kind of Chinaman Hudson Taylor dressed up as? He dressed up as a philosopher. All right, by the way, I think Hudson Taylor is arguably the greatest post-biblical missionary who ever lived. So I don't mean this as a criticism, but he wanted to reach Chinese culture. He knew the philosophers were respected and given a hearing, so he grew his hair out and braided it and dressed with robes like a philosopher in the Chinese Confucian tradition. Gilmore said, I'm just a laborer. He dressed like a typical Chinese laborer, ate Chinese food. The Chinese thought vegetarianism was a higher way of living, that the most godly and noble people are vegetarians. So he became a vegetarian, Chinese style. Really kind of messed with his digestion, but he would do anything to win the Chinese. And he used medical missionary work very, very effectively, curing ailments. But this was hard. I keep saying that. I can't convey to you the hardness other than just give you some examples. Here are some citations from his journal. Eager to see some more of the country, and in the hope that I might be able to talk to him on the way, I hired a Mongol to carry my bedding and books and made a descent on a village 30 miles away. The general cold of the winter was aggravated by a snowstorm which overtook us at the little market town, and I have no words to tell you how the cold felt that day as I paraded that one street. I sold a fair number of books. That is, the Mongols are still out and about. I'm from Wisconsin, I get this. Right? I sold a fair number of books, though my hands were too much benumbed almost to be able to hand the books out. I made some attempts at preaching, but the muscles were also benumbed. That day was a cold day. I had a good time in Mongolia, but oh, the cold. Some of the days I spent in the markets were so very cold that my muscles seemed benumbed and speech even was difficult. I met with some spiritual response, though, and for that I can stand cold. Amen. By the way, amen is all through his writings. He's Scottish. Amen. I have got thin. I'm feeding up at present. I left my medicines, books, etc. there and walked home here, a donkey carrying my baggage, a distance of about 300 miles in 7.5 days, or about 40 miles a day, and my feet were really very bad. I walked, not because I had not money to ride, but to get at the Mongol who was with me. After ministering for a year, about 8 months actually, he reported back to Beijing that he had seen about 5,700 patients. Over 23,000 people had involved themselves in his conversational sermons. He had sold 3,000 books. He distributed 4,500 tracts. He had traveled over 1,800 miles. And out of all this, there are only 2 men who have openly confessed Christ. In one sense, it is a small result. In another sense, there is much to be grateful for. So from 86 to 88, other than a few brief visits to Beijing, Gilmore ministered in Mongolia. He saw a few dozen converts. He started a church in each of those market towns. All of the converts were Chinese. A soul is a soul. And he rejoiced in every single one of them. The Mongols listened. They loved him. They did not convert. In the meantime, he gets dysentery from the horrible conditions he's living in. He gets fevers, begins to weaken and lose weight, gets a number of other sicknesses. He wrote to somebody in Beijing and said, "My eyes are bad. Doctors hesitate over my heart, say it is weak, and that its condition would affect seriously an application for life insurance." I think that's a joke. Right? "This winter I've gone in for a cough, which is not a good thing at all, and it would be well for the continuity of the work that there should be a young man on the field. Don't be alarmed, though." By the way, he's in his 40s, but he wishes there was a young man on the field. "Don't be alarmed, though, and don't alarm my friends. The above is for your own private information and guidance. I still regard myself as in first-rate health." Well, they didn't agree. And in March of 1889, he was ordered back to England for furlough. He was 46 years old. His biographer Lovett says, "When he walked into my office at Cambridge, I didn't know it was Gilmore. And then he started speaking, and I started weeping and realized how inappropriate it was for me to be weeping at how he looked. But he didn't look like my friend." He visited his sons, was reunited with them, and the mission board said, "James, we know you're young, but you've done enough. You've done enough. Retire. Retire. You can use your gifts here. Just stay." And Gilmore said, "Well, actually, I didn't want to stay the whole 12 months. I miss China." And after 8 months, he returned. Set up his shop and went back to work. And I could repeat what he was doing, but we've gone over it. But let me give you one example. One day, he's sitting under his tent, and a man comes to them who's being dragged by a couple of buddies, and there was a Chinese army installation right outside the town, and a man had been shot a couple times. And so he said, "I had never seen a bullet wound before in my life. Knew nothing about bullet wounds. But one of them was pretty easy to dig out. The other one, though, was in a joint of his leg. And I had no idea how that leg was put together. And so as I'm puzzling over this man's leg, this old man walked up, and literally he looked like skin that had been stretched over a skeleton. And I don't remember what his problem was, but he said, "Can you help me?" And I said, "Yeah, in a minute." And then I examined his leg, and I felt all the bones. And after feeling them for a while, I said, "Oh, that's how it's put together." And then I was able to work on the soldier and get the bullet out, and he was fine. This is that story in his words. That's the kind of doctor Gilmore was. He worked on people. But God answered his prayer and sent him a young doctor in early 1891. He had been praying for a medical associate for years. The young man served with him for a few months and then wrote home and said, "The sights of misery, suffering, and wretchedness which gather around Gilmore's stand are simply appalling. His work seems to me to come nearest to Christ's own way of blessing men, healing them of their wounds, giving comfort in sickness, and at the same time telling them the gospel of eternal salvation through Jesus Christ." And then he got a letter from Beijing saying the LMS, the North China District, is holding our meeting this year in Beijing, and we would like you to come and be the chairman of the meeting. And Gilmore was like, "Me? Well, okay." So he climbed on a train. They had just built a train. He had never had a train before. He said, "If I'd had one of these, think of what I could have done." He climbed on a train and rode down to Beijing, and he took over the chairmanship of these meetings, was very active in the daily discussions, was really thoroughly enjoying the fellowship. And then on May 10th, he fell ill with a fever. His doctor later says he thinks it was typhus. He'd been ill with fevers so many times. What's to worry? This is Gilmore. He'll be back up in no time. He languished for about 11 days, and then he died on May 21st, 1891. He was 47 years old. When the believers in eastern Mongolia heard about it, the mourning was virtually universal. And the Chinese believers composed a letter that they sent to Jimmy and Willie in Scotland. And I must confess, I have a hard time reading this letter, but I will read it to you. This is the whole letter. We respectfully inquire for the peace and happiness of your excellencies, our brothers Gilmore. Also for the peace for your whole school. In the first place, Pastor Gilmore, in his preaching and doctoring at Chaoyang, that's one of the 3 towns, north of the pass, truly loved others as himself, was considerate and humble, and had the likeness of our Savior Jesus. Not only the Christians thank him without end, but even those outside the church, the heathen, bless him without limit. We who through Pastor Gilmore have obtained the doctrine of the second birth and received the grace of Jesus, had hoped with Mr. Gilmore to have assembled on the earth until our heads were white and in the future life to have gone with him to heaven. Little did we think we should have been so unhappy. He has already gone to the Lord. We certainly know he is in the presence of the Lord, not only praying for us, but also for you, our brothers. We will not assess that theology. We pray you, when you see this letter, not to grieve beyond measure. We hope that you will study with increased ardor so as to obtain the heavenly wisdom like Solomon, that afterwards you may come to China, to this Chaoyang, to preach the gospel widely. As the Father did, may the sons follow is our earnest desire, signed by the Chaoyang Christians. And then there were 17 names, the fruit of a life 20 years spent in Mongolia. I don't know if the sons answered that call. The biographer was a contemporary and was dead probably before the sons made those decisions. I do know that Mongolia today is a Buddhist country. There are very, very, very few Christians there. Was it worth it? Was it a waste? Did he throw his life away? I mean, he's dead at 47. His biographer, this is literally the last sentence in the book, says, James Gilmore lived a life which, if it taught no other lesson, was yet well worth living to teach this: that Jesus Christ can and does give his servants the victory over apparent non-success after the most vehement and long-sustained effort to secure success. And this is the greatest victory possible to renewed and sanctified human nature. That is, we want to see results, but only God gives results. And if we get it into our heads that we're going to manufacture results, they won't be his. And God sometimes, well, his timetable's his timetable. I have a dear, dear friend, studied at Bob Jones with him years ago. Shortly after he finished his grad degree, he went off to the Basque region of Spain to be a missionary. He's been there now 30 years. And he has a church that's basically his family and a couple of others. And he has knocked on every door within 50 miles of that place. He has worked like and I've heard him preach. What a preacher he is. But God gives the increase. What is success? It's required in a steward that a man be found faithful. And so we don't remember Gilmore because Mongolia became Christian. We remember Gilmore because he spent his life sharing the gospel with Mongolians.